Mark asks, what is the smartest training approach after a long contest prep phase? What are your recommendations for volume, frequency, intensity, and how long should this quote-unquote recovery programming be used before moving on to regular off-season programming? So I think instead of just thinking about an absolute volume amount, which I think a lot of people think about what's the right amount of reps, what's the right amount of sets, I think you should think about where you had to get to with regards to your volume during prep. Most of the time, people end up reducing their volume a little bit, or at least cutting back on their intensity, or on at least some of their harder exercises, like they might have cut back on their sets of squats or deadlifts to kind of just help with recovery and make it through. So I think probably the first thing you want to do is make an increase in volume relative to where you were. So if you've dropped your volume substantially, let's say by more than 10% from your off season, then I would go up, say, halfway back up to your off season. If you've only dropped it, like say 10% or less, then I would just probably go back up to your off season levels, and then kind of play it from there. With regards to frequency and intensity, I really don't think your frequency should change much during prep relative to the off season. Your frequency might get modified during prep if you just want to spread the volume around to make individual days less stressful. But I would kind of keep a similar frequency throughout your in-season and off-season. And then as far as the intensity, you're kind of just going to have to let the loads go where they are and don't push the RPEs too quickly just because you're impatient with regaining your strength.
Another thing, too, would be immediately, if you want a week or a few days of just by feel, which I know that we do a lot with our athletes, too. So it's not, like you said, there's not a set number, but even if there was, and we are saying like, okay, 2 to 3 weeks from now, I want to be what Eric just said. If you compete on Saturday, you don't have to start that Monday. And in most cases, we kind of don't want you to. You know, you might be a little bit swollen or bloated from the extra food. You might have a whole lot of energy. So like, don't be crazy and do like 1RM testing because now carbs are in my body and I should. So just, I like what you said, just remember where you are relative to where you ended the prep. And there's really no rush. No rush.
Yeah, I like that. Just talking a little bit more application. A lot of times after the fun week is over and you want to get back to some more structure, like Eric said, I think it's important that you just auto-regulate the loads a little bit. And a lot of times there's a nice surprise because from the extra food and a little bit more fullness, you'll notice a nice little bump in strength. And therefore, you know, if you do let a little bit of the volume slide a little bit, it's okay because you've got a nice little offset with the bump in intensity just from the feel-good training of having a little more padding and a little bit more strength and a little bit more, you know, cushioning. And sometimes you really don't have to even sweat the numbers too much. If everything was good and was set up well through your competition prep, then a lot of times, maybe after a fun week, or even sometimes you don't even need a fun week. Sometimes you can just continue your training, auto-regulate load, enjoy the strength gains, and then just continue with what you were doing during your competition prep.
A lot of times with my athletes, if we're in an 8-week cycle and they prep in week 4, it might be just like we finish. Okay, that's fine. Just finish the cycle because a lot of things are going to be different anyways. So we'll finish like weeks 5 through 8, and then somewhere in that we'll have a postseason Skype or touch base on like, okay, so now what are our goals? What would we like to see? Are there things that we need to bring up? Stuff like that. So but like what you said, I'll keep things exactly the same until they finish. And during that, there's a grace period of having some fun, moving things around, making sure the athlete gets in touch with themselves and it's like, okay, what do I want out of this for the next year or two? What are my plans going forward? Depends if they want to do powerlifting in the off season. So there's a lot of athlete dependent stuff, but I think it's good to not just have that period to let your body rest, but also like a goal reassessment too. And that'll kind of help tell you where your training should go from there also.
I think a lot of times it's like because of the end of the contest prep that now people want to change things altogether. They get excited like, okay, the season's over. Off season, they get all excited. Okay, training just has to change altogether. But remember, when you're in a deficit, your training's not going to be as good. Regardless of programming, it's always going to work better when there's food coming in. So a lot of times I try to encourage people to kind of stick with what we're doing at the end of the prep and just gradually taper things up, because your volume is going to increase just because you're getting stronger. Yeah. Without even having to add sets or reps, you're going to get stronger just because more food is coming in. So usually about a month and a half later, that's when you're probably more adapted to say, okay, now let's start piling a little bit more volume on top of that.
Especially with the cardio coming out too.
Yeah, and the cardio does come out as well, like Eric just mentioned, and energy levels just keep going up and up.
Yeah.
But I really like to just encourage like that. Some people just need that break from the structure. So even if it's just a week, maybe 2 at most, if it's just like going in the gym and just moving, kind of get away from that structure, just to kind of refresh you mentally and prepare you to get back into that structure, get you excited again.
That's a good point, that without us changing anything, stuff's going to change anyways just because you're eating.
Yeah, that's actually one thing that I wanted to mention was the cardio and what should you do with that right away, because I guess that is part of your formal moving, right? And for most people right away, like all the excess cardio is kind of like out the window. So maybe if you were doing 3 sessions a week in the off season, we'll go right back to that. And I think anyone who's prepped has done a good amount of cardio has thought to themselves, man, I would perform so much better if I just had to do no cardio, and that was the only thing I went to the gym for. So combine the food with no cardio, I think it's pretty cool, because you get like these noob gains like coming out the gates, and it's a very exciting time in your training, because it almost feels a bit unearned, and I think that is probably what I try to insist most of my athletes do, to let's just kind of run with something that's similar to what we were doing towards that last leg of the prep, and see how far this can take us, and then eventually we'll add more as we need to. And I guess one thing that we haven't mentioned is that for some people, but this is usually more so the more experienced athlete, post-show, especially after they've gone through a few preps, there's a few athletes that are the exact opposite. Well, no, actually, they're excited about the upcoming off season, but they're a little bit better at, I guess, understanding that nothing really is going to get built up in that week post-show. And some athletes actually are like, you know what, I'm just going to take a week off from the gym. I'm just going to get excited about training and all things bodybuilding again. And I think especially for more experienced athletes, if that is something that you want to go with, I don't think that's a bad idea at all. So yeah, I'd say, start conservative. You're going to make a lot of progress just because you're eating more, and then don't get back up to your, I guess, at least when it comes to how many sets you're doing per week, don't feel like you have to rush back to that. Like, you'd be surprised as to how long you can actually make progress with what you're struggling to keep up with towards the end of a contest prep. So yeah, that's about all I have to add, is I guess the fact that if you don't want to train post-show, don't train post-show. If you're really, really, really excited about like this upcoming off season, because I think everyone kind of feels like that way post-show, is that they can't wait to get to work on this and that. It's like, hey, hold your horses. It's all, if you're doing it right, you're going to take a year off, possibly 2 years off. Nothing major is going to happen that week. So just rest, recharge, and get ready to have a really good off season.